Welcome. We'll be looking at vicarious liability. Vicarious liability is a legal doctrine that assigns an injury to a person who did not take part in committing the crime but has a relationship with the person that committed the crime or injury. Caliber 215 saw it as a deviation, an aberration from the norm, holding the third person wrong for his tortious liability. This is experienced in all walks of life, in institutions of learning, in banks, industries, in schools. For instance, if the principal delegates function to a teacher to discipline the student or a student, and in the process the teacher blinds the student's eyes, that principal will be made to pay for that damage. Why? It is because the teacher is acting under the directives of the principal, who is assumed or who is employer. So this belief that for every damage, every loss caused by the employee, that the master, the boss, should be made to compensate for such a damage, because the master also enjoys the glories as a result of the services rendered by the servant. So if there should be also a damage to the master, so supposed to pay for such a damage. For instance, in banks, industries, if manager sends his driver on errand and the driver bashes somebody's car, the manager will be made to pay for such damage because the driver is acting under the direction or within the scope of his employment. So vicarious liability means assigning blame or making somebody to pay for a crime that he did not commit because he has a relationship with the person that committed the crime. For instance, in the family setting, if a daughter commits a crime, the father will be made to answer or to pay for that damage caused by the son or servant, because he is a son to the father or the mother. This liability has two major principles, which we call the principle of vicarious liability. One of them is respondent superior. Respondent superior. It says that let the master make an answer. Now, why would the master make an answer? This is because the master is the employer and the employee is a servant who is acting under the directions of the master. So the master who takes care of the subordinate should also make answer for every question that should be addressed to the employee. Another principle is the principle of quim facet alium facet passe. Quim facet alium facet passe. This principle states that every function that is being carried out by the subordinate is assumed to have been carried out by the master. For instance, if the master, who is A, if A, who is the master, delegates function to B, it's assumed that that function is being carried out by A, who is the master. And as such, the master must be made to pay for every damage suffered by the employee. Another thing is that so long as the master enjoys the glories that comes from the servant, that comes from the driver, or that enjoy the services of the servant or the employee, and as such, it should also be made to pay for the damage caused by the servant or the employee. This liability also has two major limitations, which is scope of his employment. Scope of what? Employment. Now, before A could be held liable for an offense committed by B, before A could be held liable for offense committed by B, one, it must have been that B is acting within the scope of his employment. For instance, if a manager sent his driver to go to lane B and the driver went to lane C, whatever happens there, the manager cannot be made to pay for such damage because that driver is not acting according to the instruction of the boss. Another major scope is independent contractor. One of the major key limitations is the independent contractor. If that function is being carried out by an independent body, the employer cannot be made to pay for the damage because it is believed that that body is professional and has all it takes to take care of that job without causing problem. So if that function is being carried out by an independent body, the employer cannot be made to pay for any damage that will arise in the course of the operation. This liability also has three major features. One, a tort must have been committed. Before one can establish that this doctrine has taken place, it means that a crime must have been committed. If there is no crime, there is no liability, then one cannot establish vicarious liability. Another major feature is A must be an employee to B. Before B could be arrested because of the function that is performed by A, it must have been that A is an employee to B and B is the master, or vice versa. So before a manager could be held liable for an offense committed by a driver, it must have been that that driver is an employee to B. Before a teacher could be held liable for an offense committed, before a principal could be held liable for an offense committed by a teacher, it must have been that the teacher is acting under the direction of the principal. If not, the principal cannot be made to pay for any damage that is being suffered by the teacher. Another feature is that even if the principal is made to be held liable for an offense committed by teacher, that does not mean that the teacher is free from the blame. No, the teacher is also liable. He is never insulated from the crime. That teacher is also liable. In as much as the boss is made to pay or held liable for an offense committed by the subordinate, it does not also mean that subordinate is not liable for such a crime. He is also liable, but the boss, who has all it takes, who has the wherewithal, will be made to pay the damage suffered by the subordinate. This is what is meant by vicarious liability. Thank you. As we see on the whiteboard.